"Hey, dumbass, can't you read? Stay off the warden's grass." I looked at Scott, the inmate who had been walking next to me, and saw that he had indeed taken a step onto the pristine grass that sat between the concrete paths. Scott looked up, making eye contact with the brick of an officer who had yelled at him, and stepped back onto the sidewalk as we walked back from chow to our dorm. He nodded to the officer, apologizing for his thoughtlessness, and turned back to look at me. His face turned sarcastic almost at once, and Scott theatrically rolled his eyes as the tide of bodies around us moved like blood through a clogged artery. "Psh, stay off the warden's grass. I don't see the warden out here tending it." That was true. In fact, no one had actually tended the now lush green grass that blanketed the spots between the sidewalks. It had, it seemed, sprung up overnight and was as lush and green as an oldster's lawn you might see in a nearly endless suburban neighborhood. Who could blame someone for wanting to walk on it, honestly? It was just so inviting. I'd been a resident of Stragview for about a year now, and would remain a resident for the next 2 years at least. I'd been brought in on charges of breaking and entering, and the judge had decided that since it was my third offense, a trip to real prison would serve me just right. I'm not sure Stragview is what you would call a real prison, but it's certainly unlike any prison I've ever heard of. The whole place seems odd sometimes, and the old-timers tell me that this prison is sort of its own little world. Case in point, the mysterious grass. As a member of the grounds crew, I can honestly say that I have no clue how it came to be there. We're experiencing one of the hottest summers in living memory, and the grass had been reduced to mostly dirt and yellow ghost grass. Granted, it hadn't been real great before, but the riots last year had certainly messed it up. The dorm fire and the trampling feet had left most of it flat and kinda crappy looking, and all attempts to seed and fertilize it had been in vain. We had kinda given up on it. It was, after all, grass in a prison, and no one cares if it looks good or not. No one, it seemed, except the warden. I had grown to hate working grounds in the late afternoon, primarily because of the warden's attention. He had recently moved his office into the old tower that loomed over the compound like a monolith. The place was supposed to be full of rats. At least that's what I had heard, and I couldn't imagine anyone wanting to be there. The rats were supposed to be territorial, and if you believe that one guy, there was a huge one that lived under the tower. He had told anyone who would listen about it, right up until Henderson put him off inside grounds. Honestly, I'm not really sure what happened to him after that. At any rate, I was talking about the warden. If the rats in the tower bothered him, he never showed it. He worked up in that tower all night sometimes, and if it was overcast or the sun was going down, you could see him pacing around on the catwalk around the top of the tower, watching inmates and guards scurrying about below. He would watch us on inside grounds sometimes, and I could swear that I could feel his eyes on me way too often. He watched us seed the grass, water the grass, fertilize the grass, and always with that look of disapproval on his pinched face. Then one morning, we arrived to find this lush sea of green grass where the old grass had been before. We had been speechless. We had been prepared for another day of watering and fertilizing, but now there was simply this collection of lush grass in between the sidewalks. Even Henderson looked shocked by its sudden appearance. Rory had taken off one of his work boots and stepped onto it and told us it was soft, like the grass his grandma's yard had when he was a kid. She had some kind of grass with a hard name to say, and Grandpappy kept it nice and green for her, he told us. Henderson had been summoned to the tower then, and had come back with a very specific set of instructions. "No one is to step foot on that grass," he said, giving Rory a very hard look. "We are to put out signs. Each one of them is in a specific location around the sidewalk, and we are not to step on the grass while we do it. The only way you are permitted on that grass is if you're riding one of those new lawnmowers. This is extremely important. Do not ever set foot on that grass. That's a direct order from the warden." "And what if we do?" asked Jax, an imposing inmate who seemed to live to be contrary. Henderson gave him a hard look and said, "Then I lock your ass in confinement, and we see how you feel about that." So we set out the signs, and only stepped foot on the grass to step onto the new riding lawnmowers the warden had bought for us to maintain the grounds with. I, for one, didn't like to ride the mowers. I was one of 4 inmates who was allowed to ride them, of course. Certain members of the grounds crew were deemed untrustworthy when it came to the mowers, so we had to take turns with them. Despite the heat and the drought, the grass constantly seemed to need mowing. You could mow it just before knocking off for the day, and it would need cutting again in the morning. The grounds felt strange when you rode over them. Henderson claimed it was the vibrations from the mower, but I know what I felt as it chugged over those small patches of ground. It was like being on a boat when something large swims beneath it. I guess I learned how right I was about it a week later. Scott and I walked back after we'd been chastised for stepping on the grass, and he muttered and griped the whole way back to the dorm. We fell in line with the rest of them as they tried to make their way back, and Scott seemed to seethe all the more as he waited in line. Scott was someone whose parents had probably never told him no, and it had most certainly brought him to this point in his life. He hated authority, but seemed overall cowardly once confronted by them. This was typical behavior for him, and I just rolled my eyes as he sat there muttering to himself. Just friggin' grass. Don't see why I'm such a dick. Tell me. I'll show. Just let it go, dude. No one is supposed to walk on the grass. Did you think they made an exception just for you? Hell, I take care of the grass, and I'm not even supposed to walk on the grass. It's so stupid, though. What possible harm could come from walking on the grass? Well, if you do it, then other people will think they can do it. Pretty soon, the grass looks like crap, and then I have to work twice as hard to make it look nice. Maybe they just want something nice for a change. I don't know, but it's a rule, and we have to follow it, no matter how stupid we think it is, I added with a little wink. It's so stupid, he raged. You just know the guards are out there laying in the grass after they put us up for the night. Why the hell can't they just let us have something nice too? I agreed with him, but silently I doubted it. The guard earlier, that brick that was de Bontar, had sounded angry about having to tell Scott to get off the grass, but there had also been something else below the surface. Had it been fear? Not fear of a reprimand, but maybe fear of something else? Scott hadn't noticed, but I thought, just for a second, I had seen him glance around the grounds in a strange, fitful way, like a man on a boat checking for sharks after someone falls overboard. Henderson looked around like that sometimes too, his usual placid face watchful as he worked. He shouted more and lounged less, especially when someone tried to walk on the grass. This was new for him, and it had not gone unremarked by the other inmates. The guards seemed scared of something, and that grass seemed to be the reason for their fear. I got back into the dorm, Scott heading to the day room to watch TV, and I went to my bunk to chill out and listen to some music. It had been a long day of cutting grass out in the hot sun, and I slid my earbuds in and tuned on some music, closing my eyes and vibing out for a few minutes as the world just sort of passed by around me. It's funny how these simple pleasures can really make a difference in a place like this. I felt my mind drifting a little as the music took me back to a time before I was trapped in this bunk room surrounded by sweaty, stinking men. That's when I didn't hear the officer call me until his boot kicked the corner of my bed with a less than gentle impact. I opened my eyes to see the displeasured face of Sergeant Farcree as he tapped the side of his boot against my bunk. I looked at him, and he looked at me, and I could already tell that coming out here to tap my bunk was not his first attempt to get my attention. I took out my earbuds and asked him how I could help him. For starters, you maybe listen up when I call your name over the loudspeaker. I've been trying to reach you for nearly 30 minutes. 30 minutes? I haven't even been back from chow for... But one look at my watch told me that was a mistake. I'd come back at 5, and it was nearly 7 now. Had I dozed off? I rarely lost time like that, and the idea that I had passed out was a little alarming. Medical just called to let me know that you missed your pill call-out. You need to go get meds from the pill nurse, like now, before the sun goes down. I got up, slipped on my Crocs, and went with him to the door of the dorm. He got on his radio and let Control know that he had one inmate leaving for medical and let me out onto the yard. He told me to hurry. Count would be in about 20 minutes, and I left out for medical pavilion. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was suddenly alone on the yard. The medical pavilion was on the other side of the compound, through the center gate, and into the outer ward, and it would be a long trip by the sidewalks. As I turned, taking the concrete path, making my way towards the center gate, I saw the grass that lay between and realized I was going around my elbow to get to my knee. I could just cut across the grass and be there and back before even anyone called a count warning. I knew I shouldn't. We all knew that we shouldn't, but it was such a short stretch. Plus, the grass was just so inviting. I looked at the yard and saw no one. I looked at the captain's office and saw no one standing around it smoking. I looked at the warden's tower and saw no one standing on the catwalk. I took a tentative step out into the grass and sighed as the light brush of it struck my legs. It was so nice, so soft, and Rory had not been wrong. I bent a little and ran my hand over the grass, feeling it tickle my palm as I went. I had never felt grass so luxurious, and I closed my eyes as I walked, waiting for someone to yell at me. I didn't care if I got chastised. I was enjoying my time in the grass, and I walked slowly through the tickling bristles. I was halfway across the 15-foot stretch of grass when I felt that small boat, large animal feeling beneath me. I can't explain it. It makes no sense. But I was suddenly moved to run. I needed to run flat out, get back to dry land as quickly as possible. I ran, despite running being the biggest no-no of them all. People who ran in prison drew attention. Running means an emergency, and it was the first thing they taught you not to do. I felt the grass tickle me as I ran, that feeling of enjoyment melting away. The tickle was now something akin to whiskers of some animal that ran over my nerves. That swelling feeling beneath me grew, like a whale getting ready to breach, and I jumped the last few feet to make it to the concrete. I fell on my hands and knees, bloodying my hands and scuffing my knees as I came onto the sidewalk. I turned my head, expecting to see something split the ground, but there was nothing. The grass waved placidly, the night birds called softly, and the compound seemed peaceful. I walked in a fitful mess, the grass on either side of me looking deceptive as I walked. Every stalk seemed to wave to me, seemed to entice me, seemed to say, "Come frolic in me, it's okay." I could remember a picture book from when I was a child about a choo-choo train that had gotten in trouble for playing in buttercups, and the grass looked like those buttercups had. So warm, so inviting, so much like a trap. I walked to the medical pavilion as sunset set around me, feeling so much better once I got past the center gate. I was stuck in medical for count. I had taken longer than I thought, I guess, and when I got out, it was nearly full dark. I had almost forgotten about the grass somehow, though I'm not sure how. Seeing it again made me remember the experience anew, though. I stopped at the gate, looking out at all that grass, and felt my legs getting shaky. I didn't feel like I had the strength to walk back across that grassy field, even on the sidewalk. I clung to the fence as I waited for someone to notice me. At that point, I would have gone to confinement if it meant I didn't have to face that swaying green trap again. Unfortunately, someone wearing blue found me first. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" I turned and found Jensen, an inmate I knew from around the compound. Jensen volunteered to work inside grounds sometimes, and was just an all-around nice guy. He lived in a different dorm than I did, but he was well known for being a hard worker and a go-getter. He appeared to have been coming out of medical, and I remembered that he was an orderly. He was probably just getting off of work, and he looked around the yard as the post lights came on, bathing the grass in a bright light. "Looks like a pretty night. Need a hand back to your dorm?" He could clearly see that I was in distress, and his first impulse seemed to be to help me. I thanked him, and the two of us started making our way back to my dorm. As we walked, he babbled on about a long old day, and I must have looked half crazy as I walked beside him, craned my neck around in paranoia. I felt like something in that grass was watching me, and it seemed odd that there were no guards around either. Where the hell was everyone? Inmates weren't usually allowed to just stroll along after dinner time. The absence of guards made it all seem worse, and I found myself turning my head fitfully as we walked. When we came to my dorm, I sighed and turned to thank Jensen. I felt pretty silly now, being spooked by whatever that had been, and I hoped Jensen wouldn't tell people what a friggin' scaredy cat I had been. I had acted like a damn child, and now that I was back at my own door, I couldn't imagine why I had been so spooked. "No problem at all," Jensen said. "You know, since no one's out here, I think I'm gonna run back through that grass and get back to my dorm. It looks so soft, like that grass my dad used to fuss with back home." I tried to warn him not to, but he took off running towards the stretch between my dorm and his dorm. I saw him slip off his Crocs as he got to the edge and run barefoot into the tall grass. I watched him go, my warning dying in my throat, and I felt even sillier as he made his way through that luxuriously tall grass. Jensen didn't seem to have any qualms about the grass, and I was almost jealous as he walked barefoot through that tall, soft grass, right up until something breached the ground and swallowed him in a single bite. It dove back down like an orca picking off a bird from the surface, and the ground and the grass looked just as it had before. The officers came running when I started screaming. They came from the captain's office and from the dorms and from all over to see why an inmate was out after dark and screaming like a lunatic. They drugged me off to a show cell in medical, and I spent the next few days eating food off a styrofoam tray and gibbering about grass monsters and Jensen's disappearance. They let me sit in there for 3 days, raving and ranting, before the warden came out of his tower to have a look at me. I can still remember him sitting there in his pinstripe suit and little gold glasses, staring hungrily at me through the glass. "I understand you saw something the other night." I nodded, preparing to speak, but he cut me off. "I'd suggest that if you ever want to get out of this place, you forget what you saw and go right on cutting that grass and not thinking about it." "Oh," he said before turning to go. "Do continue to tell your friends to stay off the grass, though." My hospital stay was almost a month behind me now, and I've nearly convinced myself that I hallucinated the whole thing. Every time I notice Jensen is gone, though, I remember and have to resist the urge to go batshit crazy all over again. I wouldn't even be writing this, but I need someone to get me out of here after what I saw today. I can't stay here another minute, not knowing what I know. I was on my mandatory day off. We get at least one a week, and I was walking the track on the rec yard. I used to play basketball, or lift weights, but these days I seem to be just listing through my stay here like a ship with no rudder. I was circling the track by the back fence when something caught my eye and made me leave the track for the grassy area in between. Normal grass, yellow dead grass, not that weird grass like out on the compound. Not that weird grass like I saw beyond the fence. I started walking towards the fence, ignoring the guards who yelled at me as I wrapped my fingers around the cold links. I could hear them calling me again, but I barely noticed. Outside the fence, butting up against the woods themselves, was a thick wall of tall grass. It was lush and green and unending. And as I watched, the grass rolled like a tide as whatever resided within it moved about, looking for its next victim. So, Mr. Mason, if any part of this letter reaches you, I beg you to get me a transfer somewhere else. Otherwise, I might not make it out of these walls alive. Good evening, my little creeperonis. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's reading. If you'd like to support the show, consider signing up for our Patreon. It's linked below. All of my $5 patrons have their names read out at the end of the video, so your name could be first. Or you could always buy one of my books off of Amazon. The latest one is linked below, Dark Journeys. If you like what you hear here, come join me on TikTok, where I also do readings and have fun content. And as always, we thank you for stopping by. Come by Sunday for another story. And as always, have a wonderful evening.